So does anybody know what President Emeritus really means? It means not president anymore. It means somebody else is now president and I'm just there for advice, which is a nice thing to do, which means basically I have nothing to do at all with BPMA anymore. I want to talk about stakeholder management because I feel like it's the most important skill that nobody really teaches. I feel like, you know, we've talked about a lot of things today, frameworks, skills, things you got to do, some of it kind of naughty and technical, right? You know, but none of that's going to work if nobody else buys into anything you are putting down, right? I feel like it's an enabler for everything else. It's the soft skills that make the hard skills work. And so I'm going to tell you a story about a time for me when it didn't work out so good. This was my first official job as a product manager, and I worked for a company that had an existing product, a software product, and I had an idea for our very first internet product. And it was going to change the company. I was convinced. It was going to be the thing that propelled us toward IPO, I was sure. I had done the research. I had done some early prototype testing with customers. They were super responsive. I felt like we had product market fit even before we launched. I avoided what I thought were all the classic mistakes of not, like Paro was just saying, not testing the pricing, not testing the messaging, not testing the value prop before you go to market. And so I was about 2 weeks from launch of what was, and I still believe was, the very first online print shop for marketing materials. And it was going to be called Letter Builder. And as you can see, it didn't really turn into a giant success because the domain is still for sale this day. What went wrong? Well, like I said, I was about 2 weeks from launch and I was super pumped. I was convinced that everything was going to go great. And so I walked down to the VP of Marketing's office and I was all excited to talk about what marketing was going to do to support the launch. And before I could get anything out, she asked me what my marketing plan was. And I was a little confused because I thought my job was to build the product and her job was to do the marketing, right? Well, it turned out that the marketing team's budget and goals and plans were all completely locked for the whole rest of the year. And she had no time or inclination to help out with the launch of this product that, as far as she knew, had zero revenue. She had plenty to do, a very strong business case for everything she had in the business plan, and I had an idea. So I stumbled out of that meeting into a meeting with the head of sales, which went very similarly. Comp plan was fixed, numbers and quota was set, and no room at the inn for my baby product. And I stumbled out of that meeting to a lunch that the president and the CEO were taking me to celebrate the launch of my product. And the first question out of the CEO's mouth when we got into the car was, "So, what are your expectations for the product launch?" It was a very quiet lunch. The product never went anywhere. It took us another 3 years to come back to doing something on the internet. This was during the dot-com bubble phase, and we basically disinvested in the whole thing. I don't want you all to make that same mistake. I might have had product market fit, but I did not have what I would call product organization fit. I had forgotten about marketing. I had forgotten about sales. I had forgotten about the support team. I had forgotten about the finance team and the margin. And I had forgotten about our services team. I'd forgotten about everybody outside of my little bubble of product managers, designers, and engineers. And my friend Clément says, a great plan, but with poor understanding or buy-in from the rest of your organization, you're not going to get the results you're looking for. That was my baptism of fire, my first stillborn product. So since then, I have set about, I still have kind of PSD about this. So I set about to build myself a practice as a product person, product leader, to use Tokes' term, that would build a coalition to launch anything that I wanted to launch or change anything. And these are the 5 components of my framework. You need to manage your stakeholders, and you need to start by identifying them. Figure out who they are. Who do I need to talk to? So you start with the org chart, right? I don't know if some of you have maybe seen this before, but the official org chart is not really all that useful for telling you who really is in charge of what, or where the relationships are. I love this cartoon. You can't figure out who's really important or who influences who by looking at the org chart. I worked for a company once where I worked for the CEO, and I thought he was my boss, and he made all the decisions, and if I made him happy, everything would be fine. Turns out I was wrong. Turns out the guy with the closest relationship with the board, who held the purse strings on everything we did, was the CFO. He was really de facto at the top of the real org chart. So I developed something called the TIPS framework, which uses, and we have a little text mishap here, but what that's supposed to be is a 2x2 grid measuring influence versus interest. And by influence, I mean influence within your organization, ability to make decisions and make them stick, or influence decisions. And by interest, I mean, do they care about what you care about? Do they care about your product or your goals or your project or your initiative or whatever it is that you're in charge of? Now, this is actually a familiar matrix for many of you, I'm sure. It's sort of classic, but I've taken a little bit of time to add something to it that I call the TIPS framework that allows you to classify and describe the people who sit in every one of these categories in terms of their stakeholderness. One is your team. And by your team, I mean literally the designers and engineers and data scientists and testers and stuff on your core team. But I also mean anybody who really fits the high influence and high interest vertices here. Somebody else who's maybe an executive who's really into your product and has power and is your, say, executive sponsor. You could think of them that way. Or somebody maybe even on the legal team who's going to pave the way for you. If you enroll the marketers, the salespeople, the legal team, the finance team on your mission, then they have high interest and high influence. They're on your team. Think of them that way. Treat them that way. Now, the rest of the matrix are people who are not quite so bought in. There are people who are impacted by any decision you make with the product. Think the support team. You release a product without high usability and reliability, they're going to feel the impact of that when customers call up and complain, right? And so you ideally want to enroll at least some of those people on your team so that you get a preview of that and they inform your plan. Then there are subject experts. I mentioned the legal team. If you need a click-wrap agreement, or you need a partnership agreement, or a license agreement, or something, they're your friends. Or you need to understand the regulatory environment, they're your friends here, and you can enroll them on your team too. And if you don't, you may run into a stumbling block late in the game where they just say, wait a minute, this is not okay. It doesn't meet our standards, or you're not allowed to use this open source framework because the license agreement is not favorable or whatever. So bring those people in early too. And then there really are the power players, the people who are not necessarily interested in your product and its success, but who can support or kill it one way or the other with just a word in the right person's ear. That could be somebody who doesn't seem prominent on the org chart. It could be a founder who's now in a strategy role, but who, if he doesn't like your thing, it's off. Or it could be the CFO, and you didn't know it because it's not on the org chart that way. So you got to figure out who these people are. Now, you might be saying to yourself, I think he just named everybody. And that's kind of true. Everybody potentially in the entire organization is a stakeholder. And it gets worse. Most of them don't work for you. Possibly all of them don't work for you, right? So that brings us to the next step along the way. You've identified the stakeholders, you got to prioritize. You can't manage everybody 100% of the time. You can try, but there's probably too many of them, and you need to sleep sometime, unless you're rich. I don't think he sleeps. So how do you prioritize them? How do you figure out who the power players are that you need to have on your team instead of in that disinterested quadrant? Well, first you need to figure out who are those power players, so we have a little quiz. QR code right here, or go to slido.com and put in this hashtag. And I want you to vote and tell me which department in your organization has the most power and influence. Is it the product team, or the engineering team, or the sales team, or what team is it? And we'll see what you guys say. That's one answer. Okay, founders, yep. Keep going. Let's see what we get. Ooh, we got music while you guys do this. I should have asked for Jeopardy music. Okay, product management just jumped up there a little bit. Sales is picking up, finance is picking up. Product management again. Sales and finance are neck and neck. It's sales behind. That's right. Okay, it's pretty stable at this point. So you know what? I'm going to give you guys credit for having a more realistic sense of reality in your companies than a lot of product people. I can't tell you how many times I have asked the same question, and product has been at the top. And right, you're shaking your head because, no, we know better than that, or we should know better than that. It's wishful thinking that we're super product-led. And founders don't usually win, but you know, if it's a smaller, earlier stage company, totally makes sense. And there's the Jeopardy music. Thank you so much. Finance and sales. It's what I often see is sales near the top. And maybe I biased you by mentioning the CFO twice on finance, or maybe you all really work for strong, financially driven organizations. I'm surprised to see engineering that low. Often there are very engineering-led organizations, but that's in traditional tech companies, right? And if you're in a business that has adopted tech recently, well, then that's not going to be the case. So I hear you. I hear you. You've got to figure out for your organization what the answer is here, and figure out who the power players are within that department. I'll tell you a story about my experience with this. I worked for a software company, enterprise software company, and we had 200 engineers, and they were about half the company when I joined. And I thought, okay, this is an engineering-led organization. I have a challenge in making a dent as a product manager when engineering is so strong. And I set about creating a cross-functional coalition between product and engineering and design and test and documentation, and that was my core team. And I had a good relationship with those folks. I also had good relationships with the other product teams, similar pods around the organization. And then I systematically went about getting to know the vendors and the partners, the customers, the marketing team, the PR team, the executive team, the finance team. It was not, though, until I started helping out with sales that I got promoted. And that was an interesting data point. It taught me that maybe the organization was not engineering driven after all. Maybe it was sales driven. Now, I still wasn't 100% convinced, but I did have a good data point. So I've worked out a few other ways, a few other clues to who's really in charge in the organization. What department did your CEO come from before they were CEO? Right? If they were a salesperson, the apple does not fall from the tree. If they were an engineer, okay, right? And the CEO of my organization used to be a salesperson. And which department has the least trouble getting approval to hire, right? And which department asks more questions, challenging questions about your roadmap when you make the presentation? I had to make a roadmap presentation every year at the sales kickoff, and man, it was a grill fest. Which department rewards people from other departments for helping out? The annual sales kickoff was also at an awards dinner where the salespeople got awards for, hitting their numbers. And usually they picked out 1 or 2 product managers and marketers and people like that to thank as well. And again, I never got one of those awards until I started helping out closing deals. Which department has a C level, a chief something, rather than a VP something, right? That makes a difference. And then finally, who does the CEO have coffee with? It turned out at this organization, the CEO had coffee in the morning every single day with the head of sales operations because he was the guy who knew what the state of play was on every single deal in the pipeline. So by this diagnosis, it's 100% sales driven, that organization. And I sat in a conversation between a CEO and a customer, and my boss, the head of both product and engineering, was in the room, and the customer said, so you're going to continue to support this product that we had already end-of-lifed, right? And before my boss could say anything, the CEO said, of course. So lesson learned there. And you can use these same questions to ask yourself, where does the real power sit? So, all right, we've figured out who we really need to prioritize among our stakeholders. And we need to understand them, I think, is the next step. Not just go and tell them what we think and hope they buy into it. I think before you talk, you need to listen. And I think the only way to do that effectively is to have what I call a high bandwidth and high intimacy conversation. So I made this, again, I love a 2x2 grid because I'm a product person. I can't help myself, right? And on the lower left, you have things which are low bandwidth and low intimacy, like a tweet. Maybe you would fire somebody by tweet. I can't imagine anybody would do that. But I think there might be a precedent out there somewhere. And what I mean by bandwidth is there's not much information in that. It's only text, and it's only 140 characters. Well, 280 now, but still, it's limited in size. So you don't get tone of voice. You don't get body language. You don't get inflection. You don't get the chance to follow up instantly and say, wait, did I understand you correctly? And what I mean by intimacy is it's a one-to-many channel. It's however many people I have as followers and who happen to be searching for the keyword I used, the hashtag I used at that moment. So it could be thousands upon thousands of people. So it's not a very intimate, mutual understanding kind of conversation. At the far end of this spectrum is face-to-face and one-on-one. So the best way to understand and make a connection with a stakeholder, once you've figured out who the power players are, is have coffee with them. Have a beer with them. Find an excuse to sit with them in the lunchroom. Do it face-to-face. And ideally, you notice I just mentioned a bunch of things that are informal. Coffee, lunch, beer. I mentioned that for 2 reasons. One is informal is also better for getting off of the script, out of the formality, and kind of hacking the friendship code, with these people. And I mention it for another reason. Cake seems to be the theme today. And there's a reason for that, I think. We all find cake and food and drink appealing. So it sets a good mood when you're with somebody. And also it turns out, ask me about this later if you want, blood sugar makes a difference in how people think. When it's going up, people are more willing to consider alternatives, take risks, be creative, think out of the box. When it's going down, they shut down. Literally, parts of the brain shut down. So see if you can get something positive going and something informal. Now, the other thing I would say is when you're listening to somebody, it's important to really hear what they're saying and be able to read between the lines of what they're saying, because not everybody is going to come right out and tell you exactly what they really think every time. And I think people's motives are kind of like black holes. You can't see them directly, but you can infer them. You can infer them from the influence that they have on the world around them, the actions they cause others to take. So you can infer what is on someone's mind by simple things like, what's their job title? If you don't know them well, but you show your roadmap to a salesperson, well, what are they going to say? They're going to say, can I close business with this? They're going to say, is this going to help me close business with this? And by the way, I want some other things on this roadmap too. That's the lens through which they see it, and you can predict that just because of how they're paid, like Rich said this morning. But it's different for other folks. It isn't just salespeople, it's also finance people. They're like, well, what about the margin? And when do we reach profitability? Or it's about the engineers. Do you know how much damn work this is? What about all the tech debt that we're ignoring? You know, not everybody thinks the same just because of their job title, but it's not a bad starting place. You can test for that when you talk to them by listening for clues. Start with what you know, then observe whether you're right or not. You can even say things like, well, as an engineer, if I were in your shoes, I might be worried about whether we are taking care of the tech debt. And then let them say, well, yeah, I'm glad you said that, because I've just been worried about this a lot, and here's all the reasons why. Or let them say, well, no, actually, we have a mechanism for taking care of that. It's 20% of our velocity all the time, and I think we're making decent progress. And now you have a better understanding of that particular person, but you started with an understandable assumption that you asked for confirmation about. The most important thing, I said this earlier and I want to say it again, especially the early establishing of a relationship with stakeholders is the listening. It's not the talking. It's about getting them to express themselves clearly and you explicitly making them feel like you heard them. I said this to somebody out in the hall just 10 minutes ago. I said, I think you can tell people what you think and try to convince them, but you have to listen to them first to earn the permission for them to express it in a way that they're going to hear it. It also helps that you're going to learn a lot by listening to them about their assumptions, their language, their values, and you can tailor what you say to those things. You can adjust the language that you speak, or at least the dialect. I want to give you a few tips on adjusting, particularly in the listening part. I like to think of all of these techniques I'm going to tell you about as mirroring. That is, making people feel comfortable with you because they perceive you as similar to them. And so the first mirroring technique is posture. If you're standing with somebody who's got a very commanding posture, they're very sort of hands on hips, Captain Kirk, you know, you can stand that way too. And hopefully they will see that as commonality. Now, depending on the culture, they might also see that as challenge. So, right? So, but you don't want to be all closed in and meek either. So calibrate accordingly. Similarly, fronting. Very often, people aren't sure whether they're really being heard. So instead of listening to them like this, listen to them straight on like this to make it absolutely clear that you are listening to what they are saying, that you are attentive and you are hearing them. Eye contact says the same thing. If you're making eye contact with somebody, then they feel like, okay, there's a connection happening and they are absorbing, you are absorbing what they are saying. Now again, that is also culturally different. Some cultures are uncomfortable with a lot of direct eye contact and some expect it. And if you're not looking directly at them, they're like, is this person even paying attention? So you've got to calibrate that to the individual you're with and to the culture of that individual. But if this is the comfortable spectrum for them, then you want to be near the top edge of engaged without making them feel uncomfortable. Similarly, leaning forward. Literally, I mean, you can even do this stuff on Zoom, right? You can be like, tell me more. You know, and just really demonstrate that you are interested. My favorite, though, especially on Zoom, where you really don't want to interrupt somebody by saying words because it screws up the duplex and suddenly you lose a little bit of what they said, or maybe they think you're interrupting them. So instead, you use body language. You go like this. You give them the triple nod. Yep. Okay, right, yeah. Or the other thing is punctuation gestures. A lot of people talk with their hands. I do. And so you can imitate their punctuation gestures. If people tend to point a lot, you can point. If people tend to be like, well, sure, then you can do the same thing. And you can do it silently in a meeting or on Zoom. You can imitate their own punctuation gestures. So if you notice that every time somebody makes a point, they pretend to be Italian, then when they make a point, you can punctuate it for them. And then they feel like you heard them. They feel like you're on a wavelength because you are acknowledging what they are saying. Then there are some verbal things you can do too, like word choice. You can use similar terminology. If they like a lot of buzzwords, okay, you can say AI and generative and blockchain if you need to. And you can use the corporate acronyms, right? There are always a bunch of 3- and 4-letter acronyms. You got to learn them and use them. And you can throw words around like agile and whatever you need to throw around in order to be understood. But make sure you understand the audience, because if you're talking to executives, well, then you just talk, as Rich said, in dollar signs. But if you're talking to engineers, you talk in code, right? So make sure you got the word choice right for the particular audience. And then there's also speaking style. You know, maybe the people you're talking to are just like super chill, and you can just like slow down and be from California too. Or you can be hyper and from New York, and you can be there in a New York minute and just be there really right with them, or you can get really excited and just go crazy. And it depends on the audience. It depends on them feeling like you're with them. When they feel like you're with them, it's much more likely they'll be with you. And so that's where the last bit, the leadership bit, comes into play. I feel like I was having a conversation just yesterday about how decisions get made in organizations. And you need to understand how decisions happen in your organization. And Bain & Company has this 2x2 matrix, because the only people who like them more than product managers are consultants, right? And they came up with this one about decision-making and authority for decision-making within an organization. And they said a lot of organizations are directive. That is, it's top-down. One or a few people just basically say, this is it, and everybody is expected to get on board, whether or not you agree, whether or not you had any input into the conversation. And then on the other end of the spectrum here is consensus. Consensus is when pretty much everybody has to agree before we can move forward. This is the dilemma of trying to get everybody to agree where to go to dinner when you have a bunch of relatives over, right? It's like everybody wants pizza except for the one person, and then there's a vegan, and then it's just really hard to get. Consensus. Consensus is the slowest way to make decisions and the least stable because it can change really quickly. And then there's democratic, where you can literally be voting on things. Every company is different, and the differences are informed by the founders and by the culture of the founders. Some countries are just more autocratic than others by nature. You have to kind of take a read on it. But Bain actually has a recommendation, and I wonder if anybody can make a guess. Yeah, were you right? Their recommendation is participative, and the participative decision-making style is a kind of a hybrid of the top and the bottom here. It's where one person actually has the authority to make a decision, a given type of decision, let's say priorities for the dev team, but they have an obligation to take input and consider it, to take input from all the rest of the stakeholders that we talked about, the people who are impacted and the subject experts, and they don't say it, but it's true, the power players within the organization, and your own team as well. If they're not bought in, they have the most influence on not writing the code for the feature that you asked for. So the participative style is a way to maximize the speed and stickiness of decisions while also maximizing their quality by making sure you get the right input and the right buy-in. Bain says that essentially what this boils down to in a lot of words is companies who use this style are more successful. So we can make a business case for putting product managers in charge of everything, despite what Bradley says. No, I'm exaggerating, but you can, I think, as anyone with any influence within the organization, you can push your organization toward participative from whatever other quadrant it is in today, just by leading by example, just by inhabiting that upper right quadrant and saying, does everybody agree that this is a product management decision? Who else needs to be involved? Let me make sure I get the right input. Let me make sure that people feel heard before I make a decision. And if you really telegraph how you're planning to operate, a lot of the time people will follow your lead on that. They might argue with you, well, I actually don't think that's a product management decision, or maybe a piece of it is, and another piece of it is engineering's decision or finance's decision, and that's fine. If you get alignment on which pieces you own, and you explicitly tell people how they can be involved, you have a much better chance of getting where you want to go. And that leads me to the, what I really want to wrap up on in terms of leadership, and that is stakeholder management is not a matter of managing requests or getting approvals or sign-offs or objection handling or pushing your agenda on other people. It is a proactive process and a proactive stance in the spirit of participative decision-making. It's leadership. Martin Luther King said it well. A genuine leader is not a searcher for consensus, but a molder of consensus. You can bring people to the table, help them understand what the dynamics are, and lead them to a good answer. I do that all the time as a coach. People frequently tell me that I don't bring the answer, but I bring the answer out in teams. And I think that's the right way to do it. I want to talk about, does anybody know what the DRI is? Raise your hand if you've heard this term before. A few people. It stands for directly responsible individual. And I think this is not a bad term for whoever has the ownership of that decision in the participative process. It came from Apple. At Apple, if you want to know who's the person to talk to, the point person on a project, it's the DRI. That's what you ask for. And GitLab adopted it from them. And that they've extended it to be, it's the person who's responsible, accountable for the success of a product, a project, an initiative, whatever it is. I think the DRI is a good way to think about this. And I'm going to end on a story about a DRI. And I want to I want to make the point that this role and this process that I've described of stakeholder management is hardly unique to tech. It's about making things happen in any organization. I want to go back to the 1940s at Ford Motor Company in the United States. Just after World War II, a young man at the time named Chase Morsi was in charge, brand new, was placed in charge of product planning at Ford Motor Company. And he'd been in the company only a few months when he found out that the executive team had decided to cancel the V8 engine that powered a lot of their cars. They thought it was unprofitable, too expensive, and they were going to get rid of it, and we're just not going to have it as an option in cars going forward after, I think, the 1949 model year. And Chase was convinced that this was a horrible mistake, that the organization would suffer for it. And he went to his boss and he said, "This is wrong, this is crazy, it will hurt our sales." And his boss said, "They've decided, what are we going to do?" And he was determined to get some data to fight City Hall. So he did the first consumer survey that Ford Motor Company ever did. And he asked consumers about their preferences and why they bought Fords versus Chevys. And he discovered that without the V8, people basically said, "Well, I might as well buy a Chevy." That was a huge differentiator. There was a perception that the Ford V8 was more powerful, more prestigious, and that it was their differentiator versus their biggest competition. He went to the dealers, found out the same thing. They're like, "Are you guys really going to cancel it? Because I think I need to change businesses." They were really quite upset about it. But the problem was that it was deemed internally as too expensive. So he asked the procurement department to actually buy a Chevy V8, take the engine apart, and price out all the parts. And he found out that the Chevy V8 was more expensive than the Ford V8 in terms of parts, in terms of cost of goods. And he talked to the manufacturing department and discovered that they already had on the planning boards a new, more efficient method of assembling the engine. And he was able to put all of that together after talking to all the right people all around the organization into a plan that showed how they were going to make the V8 engine more profitable than the smaller V6 engine. And they were going to make more money by doing it this way. There was a marathon all-day session with the executives where he presented his findings and his plan and his recommendations, and the executives did not want to change their minds. They had set their minds on this. But with every challenge that they issued him, somebody among his stakeholders stood up and said, "No, yeah, we did the analysis, he's right." And they had no choice after all day working together but to go along with sense, with the data, and with the coalition that he had put together within the organization. So that is my sort of prototype example of a DRI. He arguably, Chase Morsi, he saved the V8, which ended up powering the Mustang and the Thunderbird and iconic Ford cars that we all know. Arguably, he says in his autobiography, so take it with a grain of salt, that he may have saved the company as well, that they may have gotten absorbed by GM or something if they hadn't done that. So the DRI role, the way he did it was he aligned with the authorities, his boss, on what the objectives really are. We need to be able to make money. He aligned with stakeholders on what the metrics were, the parts prices, and the priorities were. He reviewed all the available information, sought the best advice, communicated the decision and why, and communicated progress on everything thereafter. That's the DRI's job. Sound a little like a product manager? I think that's right. So this is the whole framework. This is, I think, once you've done the market research, once you've done the testing, once you've reached what you hope is product market fit, and you want to reach organization fit, this is your checklist for launch. If you like this talk, I am right now rewriting the first draft of a book called Aligned on Stakeholder Management for Product Leaders. And if you check out this QR code, we have a early readers club that you all are welcome to join. There's a small monthly fee, but the idea is we have a small group of people who are reading and giving feedback on the drafts. We're starting to use some of their stories and anecdotes in the book as well. And we have a monthly Zoom meeting where we share horror stories and give each other mutual support and problem solve. The meetings have turned from let's talk about the book to let's talk about your challenges. And it's great. And we've really been enjoying it. I think some of you may know me because I wrote another book on product roadmaps. And I don't have a early readers club for that, but we might have one because I'm working on a second edition when I'm done with the stakeholder management book. But this will take you to my online masterclass. If you're interested in how to do roadmaps right, there's a series of videos and exercises and templates for you to use to build a modern, effective, theme and outcome-oriented roadmap. That's all for commercials. Thank you very much.